And I would like to start with the why. So why this is important. So the problem that we have in sleep medicine is that we have no consensus on what is sleep depth or sleep quality and how do we measure it. Different ways of doing that in the past. So the majority of people have been using subjective sleep reports, questionnaires like the PSQI or Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index that measures a variety of things, including sleep efficiency, sleep onset latency, etc. So these subjective reports are good, but they give us more an idea of how the patients feel, which is very important, but I guess is not the full picture in terms of how deep is this patient's sleep. Others instead have used a more gold standard way to measure sleep and sleep depth, which is the full polysomnography. So in this case, they have been looking at specific parameters that we can derive from overnight polysomnography, such as delta power and delta waves, for example. So even delta waves, they're a great way to look at how deep sleep is, but in the next slide, I will show you how delta power is not quite as powerful as ORP, for example, as at defining sleep depth. So what Dr. Younes did was to go back to logic, and logic says or would say that sleep is deeper when there are less chances of waking up. So he really went back to thinking of the idea of arousals, and arousals are basically the opposite of deep sleep. And so this is the foundation of the odds ratio product. So ORP is an estimate of the likelihood of an arousal in the following 30 seconds that is expressed on a continuous scale that goes from 0 to 2.5, with 0 indicative of very deep sleep and a probability of wake of 0. And 2.5, on the other hand, it's indicative of full wake with a probability of wake in the next 30 seconds of 100%. So we can see here a patient that has a 0.66 ORP. This would indicate that the patient is in a stable sleep, and this corresponds to more or less 23% of probability of being awake in the next epoch. So this was validated in a series of scientific publications. The first one is, based on a clinical cohort of very sick patients. So these were mainly severe OSA patients, 56 polysomnography studies. So in this figure, I'm showing you here the odds ratio product, or ORP, and is association with arousability index or likelihood of an arousal in the next 30 seconds. As we can see here, the association between ORP and arousability is linear and almost perfect, with an R-square of 0.98. What does this mean? This means that increases in ORP are associated linearly in an increased likelihood of an arousal in the next 30 seconds. So this is a pretty nice association to see. But this wasn't found just in the initial validation cohort. It was found also in other cohort. For example, on the right-hand side here, I have the same type of representation, but this time in a different cohort. This is the study from Dr. Walsh. And in this case, we have at the top the association between ORP and arousability. Once again, this is a linear relationship, almost perfect. But at the bottom here, we have the same association, but with delta power. Now, this is a log transform of delta power. So we have to look at this graph from the right to the left. So basically, this would be low delta power to high delta power here. And we can see that the association is pretty linear. So with low delta power associated with high likelihood of an arousal. But at some point about here, which corresponds to 300 microvolt in terms of power and high frequency, so the high big delta waves, they are not predictive anymore of likelihood of an arousal. So we can start seeing a plateau here in this association. So in simpler words, this means that delta power is good to predict arousability up to a certain point, but then we lack explanatory power in this side of the curve. when compared to ORP. Instead, ORP can give us way more information about depth of sleep and arousability in the next 30 seconds. But how is ORP computed? So we know that traditionally we look at the EEG, so brain activity in the polysomnography through the night, and we do that in 30-second chunks. Anecdotally, this is just a mere number that was chosen because a long time ago when we were looking at PSG, 30 seconds was the only amount of time or EEG time that would fit in a ream of paper. So this 30 seconds is really an arbitrary number that we chose. And so instead with ORP, we look at this brain activity every 3 seconds. So you can appreciate how the temporal resolution of the analysis is way higher than compared to 30 seconds. So then we take this very complicated or complex wave that is the EEG signal, and we apply something called fast Fourier transform that decomposes this wave in its smaller components that are called frequency bands. And so we look at beta, we look at alpha, we look at theta, and we look at delta. So you would say at this point, well, this is what you have in traditional spectral analysis. So many other algorithms are able to decompose the EEG wave in different frequencies. The differentiator here is that we not only decompose the frequency band, but then we go and assess the power within each of these frequency band and the ratios or the interrelationship of the powers among these frequency bands. And then we assign a unique code based on this interrelationship, which then gets compared to historical data to calculate the ORP. But I'll give you a practical example of this that will make it easier to understand. So for example, I have here my 3-second snippet of EEG. As I said, I apply fast Fourier transform to this wave, and I'm able to differentiate delta, theta, alpha, and beta frequencies. And then within each of these frequencies, I look at the power. So I know that delta is 202 microvolt, theta is 14 microvolt, alpha is about 3.9, and beta is 0.9. At this point, I go and evaluate these powers within each frequencies. And the evaluation is based on my initial sample of PSGs. So I know that 202 microvolt of delta on a scale from 0 to 9, it's pretty elevated. And so I give it a rank of 8. And then I look at theta. And so 14 on a scale from 0 to 9 is medium, so I give it a rank of 4. And then I look at alpha sigma, which is 3.9, pretty low, I give it a rank of 1. And then beta is 0.9, so absent, or almost absent. And so I give it a rank of 0. So I end up with this unique identifier code, 8410. Again, this is only a label that we give to this snippet of the EEG to describe its visual properties. It's not an actual number, it's just a label that describes the properties and the interrelationship of power within these frequency bands. And then I take this number and I go back to my manually scored data, and I say, when I see 84110, which describe this type of EEG, how many times in my data this type of EEG has been scored awake and how many times has been scored asleep? So in this case, for example, this type of EEG has been scored awake 6 times, while asleep 4 times. And this allows me to calculate ORP in a continuous way. So I know that 6 times or 60% is the chances of this type of EEG being scored awake. Then I divide it by 40, and I get my continuous scale number that is 1.5 ORP. So this would be an ORP that is indicative of a pretty light sleep, closer to wake. So this is possible. So we have about 10,000 combinations of these labels. And for example, here I have indicated some of them. So in the yellow column, you can see all the possible 10,000 combinations. For example, 0000, this would indicate us that there is no amount of delta, no amount of theta, no amount of beta, no amount of alpha, no amount of beta. And this type of EEG was found 4,193 times, and what was associated with a 40.8 probability of being awake, and that translates to an ORP of 1.02. On the other end of the spectrum, for example, we can look at this one, 9998. So this would mean that we have great power in delta, great power in theta, great power in alpha, but a bit less power in beta. And so this was found 865 times. This type of EEG has a likelihood of being found in awake 14.3 times, which corresponds to quite deep ORP of 0.36. So we can do this up to 10,000 times, recognize all these different patterns, and assign an ORP code. But how ORP is presented? So the very first thing that I would want you to focus on is the figure here. So we can see here that as compared to how you're used to see, normal sleep architecture. And so, for example, you have stage 1, and then that lasts for a bit, and then you have a drastic change, and you go into stage 2, and then stage 3, etc. So you want to imagine kind of a step-like changes in sleep. ORP, being calculated every 3 seconds, gives you a much more dynamic picture of how depth of sleep changes throughout the night. And so we can highlight changes that happen very fast, even within the same traditional sleep stage. And so we can express this in different ways. We can look at this throughout the total sleep time, throughout the total recording time, but also as an average within the classical, sleep stages. So we can look at ORP during non-REM stage 2, for example, or even during REM. And then we can also look at what happens 9 seconds after we have an arousal with something that we call post-arousal ORP, or ORP9. So here, for example, I have 2 patients, patient A at the top, patient B at the bottom. We can see here in the EEG that this patient A has an arousal. It's a fairly strong arousal, and it's similar in nature to what happens in the EEG of this patient B. When we go and look at ORP 9 seconds after this arousal, we can see that this patient A is awoken here, but then is able to immediately, 9 seconds after this arousal, go back to a fairly deep sleep. Opposite, this patient here has the arousal, but then is never able to go back to deep sleep and stays in this lighter and fragmented sleep. So this situation here makes this patient more susceptible to further arousals. And this is what we use to have an idea of susceptibility of arousal and how sensitive their sleep is to further arousal. This index is pretty interesting when looking at OSA patients. Of course, a patient like patient B that is more susceptible to arousal will be woken up by every apneas that happens to him. But it's also an index that is very interesting in insomnia patients, because you can appreciate how there is a difference between the ability to go back to deep sleep immediately after being woken up by something, and this continuous sleep fragmentation that we see in patients B. Further, we might ask, why is ORP better than the traditional stages? And so I have here a depiction of several epochs of sleep and how the EEG signal visually appears. So, for example, we have this rectangle here. This is a 30-second epoch that with traditional RNK criteria gets scored as wake. And we can see that the EEG here is quite fast, likely lots of beta activity present here. which is in line with the scoring. So we know that faster EEG, presence of beta, this is in line with the scoring of wake. However, this second epoch here, we can visually see that it's still pretty fast EEG activity, but we start to see a slowing in the EEG signal. So this is a micro sleep. However, this doesn't make criteria to be scored stage 1 because it's not 15 seconds long. So if you use the traditional scores and traditional criteria, we still have to score this type of EEG as wake, even though visually we can see the difference between the first epoch and the second one. If you then focus on ORP on the right-hand side, you can appreciate how ORP really depicts this slowing or this change in the EEG. In fact, we go from 2.43, that is indicative of, of wake, and we go down to 1.59. So we see a drop in depth of sleep from this first epoch to this one. And then the same conversation can be held for stage 3, for example. So here we see an epoch that contains quite a lot of delta waves. And then we see another epoch at the bottom that contains visually way more delta waves as the previous one. However, because we don't meet criteria, we meet criteria here to score delta waves, this epoch is scored exactly the same as this epoch. However, we cannot appreciate the differences in sleep depth with traditional criteria, while ORP on the right-hand side shows that there is a change in sleep depth, and the ORP goes from 0.35 to 0.19. And then we have another way to express all of these. So we can ask how much time does a patient spend at each level of the sleep depth scale or the ORP scale. And this highlights, a pattern that can help us identify patients or a normal healthy sleeper based on the amount of very deep sleep and deep sleep that they have, and on the opposite end, amount of full wakefulness that they have. So we know that a healthy sleeper would have a balanced amount of time spent in very deep sleep, so about 10% of their total recording time. Deep sleep, about 23 to 25%. But full wakefulness is important because it gives us an indication of sleep pressure. We want to have the right amount of sleep pressure to understand that this patient is, for example, not sleep deprived. And so what can we do when we display these patterns? We can differentiate. On the left-hand side here, I have what I just showed you before, a healthy or normal sleeper with a balanced amount of time in very deep sleep and deep sleep, but also a little bit of full wakefulness. And then in the middle, I have a patient that is very different from patients as basically no time spent in very deep sleep, about 8 sleep, which is way less than the 25% in the healthy subject, and then a little bit of time spent in full wakefulness. So here, by looking at this pyramid shape of this pattern, we can think that there so this something is likely OSA with apneas, but also pain can give us this type of shape in the sleep architecture. Pain such as GI pains or pain diffused around the body. So something that doesn't allow this patient to go into very deep sleep. On the other hand, here, subject 3, we can see that this subject has a lot of time spent in very deep sleep, and basically no time spent in full wake. So something is going on here that tells us that the patient needs to sleep more, likely sleep deprived. And this is something that we would see if we have a rebound or a recovery night after sleep deprivation with a rebound effect that indicates that the body needs a lot of very deep sleep to recover. And the mic drop situation here, if you keep in mind these three different patient phenotypes, for example, is that if we look at conventional architecture, so these are the same three patients and their sleep is scored with traditional architecture, we cannot see any difference between these three patients when applying the traditional RNK criteria. So if you as a physician would see these three patients, you would say these patients are fine, no problem with their sleep quality, you're good to go home. However, as I said, ORP sleep architecture shows us that the sleep of this patient is not quite healthy, but there is something underlying, something that you would have completely missed if you were using conventional architecture. So how do we use this in clinical practice? And I guess this is the most important point for you in the audience, which are the experts that have to deal with patients day in and day out. And so we have been focusing on the use of ORP in the realm of sleep reading disorders, and particularly OSA, but also insomnia and the overlap between the two. So something called COMISA, so comorbid OSA and insomnia. But also lately we have been focusing on the use of ORP and derived metrics in hypersomnia. So I'll go through each of them in the next slides. So starting with OSA, we might wonder what benefits do we have when using ORP architecture when looking at a patient that has sleep apnea. And here I have an example of two different patients. We can look at the AHI, so apnea-hypopnea index, pretty high, pretty severe OSA for both patients when classifying patients based exclusively on the AHI. The patient on the left-hand side has an AHI of 50.6, and we can see the sleep architecture of these patients. If, again, I can focus your attention to the first and second, deciles, I can see that this patient has no time spent in very deep sleep, a little bit, like 3% of time spent in deep sleep, but a whole lot of time, 30% of the total recording time spent in full wakefulness. So this indicates to us that the sleep of this patient is really disrupted. He cannot go into very deep sleep and also has some features of hyperarousal. So for us, this is indicative of OSA, for example, but with some comorbid insomnia here. So this would indicate the sleep of a COMISA patient. On the other hand, here you have a patient that has an AHI of 43.4, so again, a severe OSA patient when looking simply at the AHI. However, when looking at the sleep of this patient, it's actually resembling the pattern of a healthy sleeper. So we have enough time spent in very deep sleep. Deep sleep is also present, and also balanced amount of time spent in full wakefulness. So these two patients, both severe OSA patients, AHI is elevated in both. However, sleep quality is way different. And so this can help us try to tease out different phenotypes or different situations in these two patients, and also allows us to, try to interpret their sleep quality and also understand how these two patients might respond differently to treatment. So you can appreciate that if you, for example, prescribe CPAP to this person, you're likely going to, reduce the AHI, but also maybe improve this portion of their sleep. So these patients maybe with CPAP, they can improve their time spent in deep sleep. However, you're not going to do much in terms of hyperarousal. So there's something else that needs to be done to help this patient to improve their sleep quality in terms of hyperarousal. On the other hand, this patient here, because their sleep is pretty good, there's nothing really that you can do to improve their sleep. So CPAP would likely help their respiratory issues, so decrease AHI. However, they will not feel the same benefits of CPAP in terms of how rested they feel the day after, because really their sleep is already pretty good. So talking about CPAP, for example, theoretically, we expect that someone that has an architecture like this that I showed you before, with no time spent in very deep sleep and deep sleep, would, after undergoing CPAP treatment, look like something like that. So more time spent in very deep sleep and deep sleep. So we expect a shift of the curve towards the left in this situation. So we have some preliminary data that look at who is going to benefit more from CPAP while looking at ORP architecture. These data were published by Dr. Younes in 2023. And so the very first detail that we have to notice is that some specific patterns have been found in patients that have severe and very severe sleep apnea. So these patterns are these three that are highlighted here, and you can notice that in all of them we have basically no very deep sleep and only a little bit of deep sleep, all of them. And we have various level of time spent in full wake. So we have a little bit here, like really minimal. We have about 8% here, and we have a lot of time spent in full wake here. So as we discussed, for example, this would be a phenotype that you would see in a patient with COMISA with some hyperarousal features here. And this instead would be what you would see in a typical OSA patients with no deep sleep and no time spent in full wake. So in this paper, Dr. Younes not only examined that these three different phenotypes are prevalent in severe and very severe sleep apnea, but also noticed that when undergoing PAP treatment, these are the patients that respond more to the therapy. And so the response, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is that they improve in their very deep sleep and deep sleep, and also decrease in some cases in their hyperarousal features, but you can see that this decrease is minimal. So we go from about 30% to 23%. So CPAP can do a little bit in this hyperarousal, but we have not fixed the problem completely. So these are, again, initial data that were published based on an initial smaller cohort. This is a retrospective study, it's not a prospective study. So here at Cerebra, we are just kicking it off next week, a research program with together with the government of Manitoba. And we are going to look at a prospective study of PAP therapy and see how ORP and ORP architecture changes from before to after CPAP. And then further, one big problem that for sure you're thinking about now is that CPAP adherence, even if people are responsive to CPAP, CPAP adherence is pretty low because CPAP can be cumbersome and can be, difficult to be compliant to. And we know that adherence ranges from 25 to 60% across studies. So Dr. Younes went and created a model that is called adherence index that is based on variables collected at a diagnostic study. And these variables are used or are inputted in a model that helps us predict adherence at 12 months. And so he tried different variables to be inserted in this equation model. And what came out of that is that three variables from the diagnostic sleep study are the ones that give us the highest prediction power in terms of adherence at 12 months. And these variables are high ORP non-REM at the diagnostic study, higher AHI, and lower SpO2. So patients that have all these three factors are likely the one that adhere the most to CPAP at 12 months. And we can appreciate that respiratory issue indicated by high AHI and low saturation, but also they have pretty poor sleep quality starting CPAP. So they are the ones that are likely going to experience the highest benefit in terms of how rested they feel after using CPAP. So this is a higher motivation in continue to use CPAP. They actually feel better. So more validation is needed in terms of the adherent index. We have, there are other characteristics that can be added to this model, such as personality characteristics, social support, or the idea that a patient has in regards to treatment. So in that study that I just mentioned to you that we're running at Cerebra, we are going to further validate the adherence index in this current form, but also try to create an adherence plus, so add some other variables to see if we can increase predictability of the model. And then shifting gears to insomnia, so the ORP architecture phenotypes can also be applied in the realm of insomnia. So we know that with insomnia, the diagnosis is not that problematic because it's really, classified or described by lack of satisfaction with someone's sleep in terms of sleep quality and quantity, and by the presence of difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, and waking up too early for a certain period of time. So insomnia, by definition, is a subjective disorder, or is very important to know how the patient feels. However, the problem is that once we have diagnosed these people with insomnia, because they tell us that they are not happy with their sleep, the treatment of these people is not always successful. So one idea behind this is that the problem stems from the fact that we have different type of insomnia people, so different phenotypes of the disorder, and also different responses to treatment. So if we use ORP architecture in this case, we can see that two phenotypes starts to appear. And we can see this specifically in individuals that have insomnia with with short sleep duration, which and these two types are more frequent in the non-clinical population. We can see here that those are individuals that have no time in very deep sleep and deep sleep, but a lot of time spent in full wakefulness. I described them previously as individuals that have hyperarousal, central hyperarousal traits. And then we can see a different type, which is a milder version of the same, with a little bit more time spent in very deep sleep and a little less time spent in a state of hyperarousal. So preliminary data from the Sleep Health Art study here show us that, again, these phenotypes are present in insomnia with short sleep duration, but are also very different in terms of associations with quality of life scores, with risk of developing cardiovascular consequences down the line, and with survival. So we see that the first type, the type that has a lot of central hyperarousal, this type is associated with low daytime sleepiness, but also very low quality of life scores, high risk of developing high blood pressure and cardiovascular cascade, and low survival rates. On the other hand, that milder type that has less hyperarousal and a little bit more very deep sleep and deep sleep, this type is actually not doing very bad. They have normal quality of life scores, and they have no increased risk of developing high blood pressure down the line. So this points out to the fact that we really have to focus on these insomnia phenotypes that are the patients that are going to have the highest consequences from insomnia. And the idea is that these patients are likely to respond to something like that will reduce their hyperarousal, such as medications, for example. These patients at the bottom, instead, they're not doing very bad, but we still have to help them to improve their sleep quality. And that can be done, for example, with CBTI. Again, these are preliminary data, more validation is needed, and we are starting collaborations with insomnia researchers all over North America and Europe to try to have prospective studies looking at how ORP and ORP architecture changes in response to medications and CBTI. And finally, a little brief mention of hypersomnia. This is a new hot topic, and we are just starting to use ORP and derivate of ORP to try to better understand, especially idiopathic hypersomnia. So we know that there's there are difficulties distinguishing idiopathic hypersomnia from narcolepsy type 1 and narcolepsy type 2. We know that hypersomnia is kind of a residual diagnosis. So when patients go through a full screening and they have no other sleep disorder, they don't meet criteria for narcolepsy, but they still complain of a lot of daytime sleepiness and need of sleep that goes greater than the conventional 8 to 10 hours. The diagnosis that gets given to this patient is idiopathic hypersomnia. So we have actually an index that is derived from the ORP that allows us to understand the individual patient's or subject's sleep need. And this is called cumulative sleep index. So what it is basically with CSI, we can look at the ORP values, instantaneous ORP values throughout the night, and the amount of suppression of wakefulness throughout the night. So in other words, ORP or CSI is the difference between 2.5, which is the ORP during full wake, and the ORP values and at each point during the recording time. The difference between the two, so in this case, the white portion of this graph here would be our CSI, cumulative sleep index. And so this is gives us again an idea of wake suppression throughout the night that is expressed that gives us an idea of quality of sleep, but also duration of sleep. So for example, here I have a patient that has a CSI of 818 unit. And so this indicates us that the quality of sleep of this patient is pretty good, and also the duration of sleep is pretty good. And again, we can see that there is a lot of white in this ORP graph that indicates that ORP it's low and different from 2.5. So here we're talking about the delta between 2.5 and the actual ORP. Differently, we can see how this patient here has a moderate sleep quality as measured by this ORP that is not completely at the bottom of this graph, but also a duration that is quite moderate. And here, this patient here instead, we can see how ORP is pretty high. We have basically no white space here, indicating that there is not much difference between full wakefulness and ORP at each single point throughout the night. And also duration is it's not optimal. So we can see that this is reflected by a lower CSI. When we go and apply this idea to patients with idiopathic hypersomnia, we can start to differentiate different types of patients. One important thing to notice here is that this analysis has been done in collaboration with Dr. Thomas at Harvard. These data are unpublished. But what is very special here is that these patients were allowed to sleep as much as they wanted. So there was no time restriction when undergoing polysomnography. This is important because it allows us to compare how would sleep be at the 8-hour mark here, highlighted by this line here, to how is sleep when we let people sleep for as long as they want. So this allowed us to differentiate 3 different type of patients, or 3 different reasons for excessive sleep time. We can see that this patient here has a CSI of 169 at the 8 hours mark. So this tells us that at 8 hours, the sleep of this person is not very good. And then if this person continues to sleep for unlimited amount of time, his or her sleep doesn't improve. So the CSI is still pretty low, 345. This patient here instead has a CSI that is medium up to the 8 hours point. But then if we let this person sleep for longer, we can see that the CSI actually increases. And then finally, this person here has a pretty high CSI, so sleep quality is pretty good in the 8 hours mark, but also is further increased if we let these patients sleep for longer. So this show us different type of patients, and also makes us think that this patient would respond differently to different treatment. For example, patient A, we know that sleep quality is not great. So what if we give to this patient something that improves sleep quality and lowers this ORP? And what if we can do that in a way that good sleep quality is condensed in the conventional 8 hours? Opposite this patient here, we see that sleep quality is already pretty good, and what this patient needs is just to sleep longer. However, we know that 15 hours of sleep are not something that everyone can afford. So perhaps to avoid the daytime sleepiness, this patient would benefit from something like stimulants that help this patient to stay awake. So this is still work in progress, but is sparking lots of collaborative ideas with other researchers and also pharmaceutical companies. Because as I said here, we have some indication that patients with low CSI with high ORP value, so bad sleep quality, may benefit from medications to improve sleep, while instead patients with high CSI with decent sleep quality might benefit more from something else, such as a stimulant. We have some preliminary data in other cohorts that show some drugs that have an effect on ORP, in lowering ORP. Preliminary data were on gaboxadol, that is not available anymore, that seem to lower ORP and arousal index. But we also know that the commercially available salt version of GPH, which is sodium oxybate, it's likely to lower ORP and improve sleep quality. On the other hand, we also know from studies that Dr. Younes did in the ICU, we know that propofol, for example, has a good effect at lowering ORP and changing ORP architecture. Again, this is all smaller studies, and everything needs further validation, but once these ideas want to spark future collaborations. So this is my last slide to say that, again, all of these needs further validation, and we're looking for collaboration, and we're looking for researchers and physicians to use ORP and use ORP architecture in their clinical practice and see actually how it works and see the difference that it makes for patients. And so at Cerebra, we have just announced the opportunity to use My Sleep Scoring, so our sleep scoring system, and access ORP through an API. And this is completely free for researchers that qualify. So we would evaluate the research proposal and the use of ORP, and we would give you free access to use this API tool to score your data and also have access to ORP. So if you're interested, you can either ask me here, email me here, or email us at Cerebra, and you can start to have a look at the documentation about this API tool in our website. We are very close to be able to deploy this at large scale, but you can already look at the document and what this API entails. I can say that if you have someone that has a little bit of IT or tech expertise, that would help, because it requires a little bit of Python coding, but it's not too complicated. So if you have time to review the documents and try yourself, I'm pretty sure that you will be able to understand how the API works. And so that's it for me now. I'm happy to take any questions and discuss any topics that you would like.